Canada's auto sector is in a very tangled web with the United States.
Imagine a continent where every bolt, every steel beam, and every car engine crosses the border not once, but dozens of times before reaching the assembly line, where the economies of the US and Canada have been breathing in unison for decades until one person decided that the breath should be American only. Today, that harmony is crumbling. A new round of tariff wars is transforming North America from an industrial union into an arena of political confrontation. And it all started with one simple but explosive thesis: America first.
Lutnick spoke at a conference in Toronto where, behind closed doors, he reportedly told the audience that when it comes to the auto sector, it's America first, Canada second.
When Donald Trump returned to the White House, he promised to bring manufacturing back home, protect jobs, and force trading partners to play by American rules. But what was intended as a revival strategy is turning into a test for the entire North American economy. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles may sound like technical terms, but in reality, they are weapons capable of destroying tens of thousands of jobs and calling into question the very future of the continent's industry. In response, Canada has stopped speaking the language of diplomacy for the first time in a long time. The province of Ontario, the heart of the Canadian auto industry, is responding to the tariffs with threats to stop the flow of energy and critical minerals to the south. This is not just rhetoric. Canada supplies the US with more than half of all imported energy: oil, gas, hydroelectricity, uranium. And if these supplies are restricted, Washington will feel the pain much more than from any increase in duties.
And the U.S. is by far Canada's biggest purchaser of finished vehicles. So the tariff war between the two countries...
Trump and his advisors are convinced that tariffs will force companies to move production back to the U.S. But reality suggests otherwise. Factories that could operate in Ohio or Michigan are starting to look for new opportunities in Germany, Mexico, and even Asia. Major equipment manufacturers are already announcing that it is easier for them to build combines for Canada in Europe than to risk new U.S. tariffs. It's a paradox. Tariffs designed to bring production back are pushing it out of the country. Meanwhile, Canada is strengthening its defenses. The Parliament in Ottawa is legislating to protect its agricultural system, known as supply management, preventing Trump from putting pressure on the dairy and poultry sectors. What was supposed to divide is uniting Liberals, Conservatives, and even the opposition are presenting a united front for the first time in a long time.
Vehicles made here have at least 50% American parts.
And in the US itself, irritation is growing. Auto giants are counting their losses, builders are complaining about rising material costs, and workers in Detroit are seeing their workshops empty. What began as a slogan of economic patriotism is starting to resemble an economic boomerang. This is not just a story about tariffs. It is a story about pride and dependence, about how trying to be first can result in losing leadership. America wants to bring manufacturing back, but it may lose trust, allies, and even control of its own market. And Canada, which has been considered a junior partner, is showing its teeth for the first time in decades.
Today we learned that he's backing down again on auto tariffs. Why is it that he's selling out our auto workers at a time when they need him most?
What we have at this point with the United States for the auto sector is the lowest tariff in the world, less than 10%, less than 10%, lower than Europe, lower than Korea, lower than Japan. We have the lowest tariff, and we are still negotiating.
Today, North America is on the verge of a new industrial era. And the question that is being asked more and more loudly is, who will ultimately pay the price for these tariffs? The answer may be unexpected. At the beginning of 2025, the tension between the US and Canada was palpable in politics, in the markets, in journalists' speeches, and on production sites. What began as Donald Trump's economic initiative to bring jobs back home gradually turned into an open trade confrontation between two countries that, for decades, had been considered examples of mutual dependence and stable partnership. When Trump returned to the Oval Office, his administration immediately announced that there would be no more exceptions. Every country, even allies, must pay the price for access to the American market. It was then that US Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick spoke at a closed briefing that instantly became a sensation. His phrase, "America first, Canada second," spread through the media, causing a cold shower effect in Ottawa and Toronto. Canadian officials, accustomed to the rhetoric of compromise and mutual benefit, heard in these words not just a position, but outright humiliation. This was particularly keenly felt in Ontario, the heart of Canadian industry, where General Motors, Ford, and Toyota car factories had provided tens of thousands of jobs for decades and accounted for 30% of the province's GDP.
I would say it's a massive threat when you have the Secretary of Commerce coming out and saying that, and the President, you'd only say it if the President gave him the green light. So we have to be prepared.
At the annual trade conference in Toronto, the atmosphere, as participants recalled, was almost solemn until Latnik took the stage. From his first words, it was clear that this was not a diplomatic conversation, but an ultimatum. He stated that no trade agreement would be signed without the introduction of tariffs on cars manufactured in Canada, and that the US would no longer allow foreign partners to take advantage of American demand to create jobs outside our borders. Silence fell over the room, and only the cameras captured the confused faces of the delegates. But the real thunder came when these words reached Queen's Park, the office of the Premier of Ontario. The response was almost instantaneous. In a special address to the press, he declared that Canada would not allow its industrial base to be destroyed for the sake of foreign political slogans. His tone was sharp, even belligerent. He warned that if Washington decided to strike a blow against the Canadian auto industry, Ontario would review all energy supplies to the United States. Not a single drop of oil, not a single megawatt will leave if they try to bring us to our knees, he said.
They don't allow our banks, and you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
These words caused a storm. American television channels showed a map on which dozens of states, from Michigan to New York, depended on imports of electricity and natural gas from Canada. Experts warned that if Ottawa did indeed cut off exports, the US could face an energy shortage in the winter of 2025 to 2026 on a scale not seen since 1770s. However, behind the loud statements lay deep fatigue. For months, Canadian officials had been trying unsuccessfully to negotiate with Washington to ease steel and aluminum tariffs imposed in 2018. These tariffs had already cost Canada billions, but it was the threats to the auto sector that proved to be the last straw. After all, the auto industry is not just manufacturing, it is a symbol of national pride. From Ontario to Windsor, from Hamilton to London, every family knows someone who works in a factory that assembles cars or supplies parts to the US.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The new wave of tariffs threatened to destroy this ecosystem. The Canadian Automobile Manufacturers Association estimated that with a 25% tariff on cars exported to the US, the industry could lose up to 60,000 jobs. American experts confirmed these estimates. The production chains between Windsor and Detroit are so closely linked that any restriction on supplies would lead to chaos. Against the backdrop of this crisis, emotions began to run high in Ontario. Factory workers staged spontaneous rallies in front of the US consulate in Toronto, and unions published open letters calling on the government to stand up to Washington. A wave of patriotic speeches swept across the country. In the town of Oshawa, home to one of General Motors' oldest factories since 1908, residents hung banners reading, "Don't sell our labor, and Canada is not a colony."
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
But there was also cold political logic behind this outburst of national anger. Ottawa understood that Trump was playing to his domestic audience by playing the economic patriotism card. His electorate in the industrial Rust Belt demanded jobs, and any compromise with Canada could be perceived as weakness. Therefore, instead of negotiations, the White House chose to apply pressure. The U.S. administration announced that any vehicle manufactured outside the U.S. would be subject to a tariff if less than 70% of its components were of American origin. This effectively undermined the raison d'etre of the common North American supply chain. In response, Canada developed its own package of measures. Leaks appeared in the media about the so-called Energy Pressure Plan, which provided for a phased reduction in exports of electricity and critical minerals nickel, cobalt, and lithium to the US states.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Political tensions rose. Demonstrations were held in the streets of Toronto with slogans such as Protect Ontario, Protect Canada, while in Washington, conservative commentators called Canada's position a betrayal of its alliance obligations. At the same time, independent analysts in the US recognized that Trump's tariff strategy had a side effect. It was pushing Canada toward Europe and Asia. By the summer of 2025, Canadian officials had begun negotiations with South Korea and Indonesia to expand car and raw material supplies, bypassing the American market. Inside the White House, as sources later reported in the Washington Post, some advisors tried to convince the president to soften his rhetoric. They warned that a trade war with Canada was not the same as a conflict with China. There would be no winners because the economies of the two countries were too closely intertwined. But Trump, according to the same sources, responded sharply, "If they want to play hardball, we'll play harder."
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Meanwhile, a shift was taking place in Canadian society. Whereas previously most Canadians viewed the US as a natural ally, the rhetoric had now changed. In opinion polls, the proportion of those who considered America a reliable partner fell from 74% to 41%. The media increasingly published articles about the need to reorient trade to other continents. Even in business circles, traditionally pragmatic in their outlook, talk of national industrial independence began to be heard. This wave of patriotism was not an empty gesture. In Ontario, emergency programs were launched to stimulate domestic demand. The government provided loans to companies that could redirect exports from the American market to the European market. Several large companies announced plans to build new aluminum and nickel processing plants to use their own resources for domestic production. It was a signal Canada was ready to survive without American preferences.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
And yet, behind this determination, there was a sense of fear. No one knew how far Washington was prepared to go. Behind the scenes, there was talk of sanctions against the Canadian energy sector, and the American media was already writing about a possible retaliatory tariff on maple syrup, a minor but symbolic detail showing how quickly a trade dispute can turn into a political farce. In the first weeks of the conflict, global markets reacted nervously. The Canadian dollar fell 3%, and the tech stock index lost 5% of its capitalization, but after a month, the situation stabilized. This came as a surprise. Canada's economy proved to be more resilient than Washington had anticipated. Experts explained this simply thanks to export diversification and high global energy prices.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Thus, the first act of this trade drama ended. The US bet on pressure, Canada on self-assertion. But even then, in early 2025, it was becoming clear that the conflict would not be limited to tariffs on cars. This was a clash of two worldviews, protectionism and interdependence, and neither side was willing to back down. After the first loud statements and mutual threats between Washington and Toronto, the crisis gradually moved into a phase of systemic confrontation. Now it was not just a few thousand jobs that were at stake, but the very model of the North American economy, built on interdependence and open borders. What had long been considered a model of successful integration, shared supply chains, unified logistics, joint technology projects was now threatened with collapse. This was particularly noticeable in the automotive industry, which had always been a symbol of cooperation between Canada and the US. 10 years ago, analysts described the North American auto industry as a single organism. Parts manufactured in Ontario were sent to Michigan for assembly, and then the finished cars were returned to Canada. Some engines crossed the border 5 or 6 times before ending up in the final car. This system worked like clockwork, ensuring efficiency and competitiveness on a global scale. But Trump's tariff policy, introduced in 2025, disrupted the usual rhythm.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Against the backdrop of the introduction of new tariffs, the largest automotive companies began to review their strategies. General Motors and Ford suspended investments in Canadian plants, and Toyota postponed the launch of a new line of hybrid crossovers in Woodstock. Soon, the first reports of job cuts appeared not massive, but alarming. Experts warned that if the tariffs remained in place for at least a year, it would lead to a capital outflow to the US and a slowdown in Ontario's economy. But an even greater risk was the chain reaction. When one country tries to sever economic ties, both sides suffer. American car factories, which depend on Canadian components, faced a shortage of parts. Factories in Detroit and Toledo reported downtime, and union leaders complained that, in an attempt to punish Canada, the White House is punishing its own workers. The paradox became obvious even to supporters of protectionism. The increase in tariffs did not make American cars cheaper, on the contrary. Their cost increased by 15 to 20%.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Meanwhile, in Canada, there were increasing calls to restructure the economy in order to reduce dependence on the US. Parliament began discussing the creation of an industrial resilience fund to support businesses focused on exports to Europe and Asia. The press called it a quiet industrial revolution, a strategy that essentially turned the crisis into an opportunity. Canada intensified negotiations with the European Union on expanding the CETA agreement. Brussels, seeing Washington's political vacillation, willingly agreed to the terms. In September 2025, the Canadian delegation secured a temporary reduction in tariffs on car exports to the EU. And within a month, the first contracts for the export of electric vehicles to the Netherlands and Germany appeared. This sent a powerful signal. If the US is building walls, Canada is opening doors.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
However, the situation within the country remained tense. Workers in the auto industry feared that Europe would not be able to instantly compensate for the losses from the American market. Union leaders insisted that existing businesses must be protected first and foremost. As a result, the government launched the Made in Ontario program, offering tax breaks to companies that use at least 50% domestic components. Posters with the slogan "Buy Canadian, Save Jobs" appeared in factories. These measures had both a symbolic and economic effect. Confidence in domestic production began to grow, and a sense of mobilization arose in society. Washington, observing this, increased the pressure. At the end of 2025, additional tariffs were introduced on kitchen furniture, wood, and even aluminum profiles. It looked like a blatant show of force. But behind the loud headlines in the American press lay growing anxiety. Each new restriction provoked retaliatory measures and increased costs for domestic producers. By the end of the year, the U.S. Industrial Confidence Index had fallen to its lowest level since 2020.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Meanwhile, in Canada, a debate was raging over agricultural policy. Washington was pressuring Ottawa to open its mark in farmers' markets, but the Canadian government was holding its ground. After the passage of a law enshrining the inviolability of the supply management system, the dispute went beyond economics and became a matter of national sovereignty. For many Canadians, this was a turning point. Newspapers wrote, "If we give in on milk, we will give in on everything." Politicians from all parties, including the opposition, supported the decision not to touch the quotas. This rare consensus was an unexpected consequence of tariff pressure. What was supposed to divide united? The Canadian press began to call what was happening the reverse unity effect. While the US was building its policy on division, Canada was rallying around the idea of protecting its industries. Ottawa even considered the idea of creating a North American Stabilization Council, which would include representatives of business and labor unions from both countries, but Washington refused to participate, citing domestic priorities. As politicians exchanged statements, the consequences for industry became increasingly apparent. Car prices on the American market rose, and deliveries from Canadian factories fell by almost a third. Some automakers began to consider moving part of their production capacity to Europe. In response, the White House increased pressure by hinting at the possibility of individual agreements with companies willing to relocate production to the US. But large corporations preferred to wait and see. They understood that the political situation could change, and that relocating factories was a costly risk.